why is it, and this is something that's always puzzled me, why is it that the left is defined by, there's certain values, and one of them is when you look at the right, you automatically think of racism, potential racism at least, dislike for gay people, homophobia. There's certain qualities that are always attributed to conservatives, and then there's certain qualities and these are social things, and that I'm not quite sure I understand. Like, why is it that the left is always associated in support of gay rights? The left is always associated in support of of all races and all genders, and
well, I think it's the dispossessed issue again. So imagine that we make these hierarchies, and they're hierarchies that are devoted towards a goal, and that the sum total of all those hierarchies is something like the patriarchy. Even though I hate that word, and I don't think anybody should use it. I don't like that word at all. But that's we're speaking within the confines of that theory.
Just defining how you're using it. What do you mean by the patriarchy?
Well, the patriarchy is the sum total of all Western hierarchies. Let's say it's the left. It's the radical leftist vision of the sum total of all Western hierarchies.
But it's always male.
Well, that's the theory, is that it's male dominated, and
that's patriarchy is a male-dominated word.
Well, and it's a funny thing because, of course, there's lots of sub-elements of the patriarchy that aren't male-dominated. So healthcare, for example, universities, the education system in general. There's lots of places where these sub-elements are female-dominated.
But so do you think that they're defined as the patriarchy? Do they define healthcare?
Well, it's a good question, Joe. I don't know what happens. If you have a sub-element of the patriarchy that's dominated by women, is that still the patriarchy? It's like the structure's still intact. It's still performing the same function. Well, now the women are running it. Well, is that the patriarchy? And the answer to that is, well, we're all vague about what the definition is, so we don't need to address that issue.
Well, here's
That's
some
the
clear
answer.
ones. Here's some clear ones, right? Like major corporations, the vast majority of CEOs are male.
Yeah.
We think of that as part of the patriarchy.
Yeah.
Government.
Yeah.
Never been a female president. Vast majority of senators, congressmen, etc., male.
Yeah, so I guess we could say, well, the patriarchy is all those elements of hierarchical structure that are still dominated by men.
Law enforcement, military, male, mostly male.
Right, but it's a peculiar definition.
Right.
Because it means you have to fractionate the patriarchy into pieces. You can no longer talk about it as a uniform structure. If you're going to take out all those pieces that are dominated by women and say, well, that's not the patriarchy. But the thing is that the whole concept is so ill-defined that it begars description.
But it's always power, though, right? I mean,
that's the other thing. That's the claim. The other claim is that all hierarchies are predicated on power, which is a claim that's absolutely appalling. It's like plumbers. Are they part of the hierarchy? You've got roaming bands of armed, aggressive, tyrannical plumbers coming to your door saying, use our service or else. Like, that's not how it works. You go look, when you're going looking for a plumber, you go look for a massage therapist, or a surgeon for that matter, or a lawyer. You go look for the person who's most competent. And one of the things the left can't tolerate is the idea that hierarchies are predicated, in part even, on competence, which they clearly are. The best predictors for success in Western hierarchies are intelligence and conscientiousness. Those are the best psychological predictors of success. They only account for about a third of the variation in success. Maybe a third is probably about right. So there's still lots of room for randomness and even for systemic discrimination. But the notion that our systems aren't predicated in part on competence is clearly wrong. Now, you asked a question about the left. It's like, well, why are the left always on the side of the people who don't fit in, let's say, or don't fit so easily in? And I think that is a matter of the consequence of hierarchical structures. So imagine in every hierarchy there's some people who don't do very well in any given hierarchy. Then imagine across all the hierarchies that there's a subset of people who are very likely to not do well in any of them. So you might say, well, they're systemically discriminated against. The left would be on their side because they're on the side, even temperamentally, of the people who are dispossessed. And the thing about that is that it's valid. Look, we need a spokesperson politically for the dispossessed. That's what the Democratic Party used to do when they worked for the working class. Is the working class needed a political voice. It's like, okay, that's the Democrats. Well, why do they need a political voice? Well, to keep the hierarchy from degenerating into rigid tyranny. It's part of the political discussion. But now the problem is and this is the problem with the left, is that, well, what's the hierarchy? It's a tyrannical patriarchy. It's like, no, it's not. It's partly corrupt, like every system. But it's less corrupt than most systems, and there's a lot of elements of it that are devoted towards self-improvement and self-monitoring. You have to be a little nuanced and subtle about these sorts of things. And you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And the leftist rhetoric has got so intense that the idea is, and people believe this, well, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Everything is getting worse in all possible ways, and there's systemic racism everywhere, and it's utterly unfair, and it should be torn down and rebuilt. It's like, no. It's actually functioning unbelievably well, even though it still has its problems. You know, and there's a big difference between saying there's systemic racism everywhere, and the reason that there isn't perfectly equal outcomes is because of prejudice, and saying, no, look, the system is functioning, let's say at 75%. It's doing all right. It's got some problems, including systemic prejudice, which hopefully will work themselves out across time and which show every bit of evidence of doing so. And so we don't need a radical solution. You know, and one of the things I've started to do with my Twitter account is to tweet out good, non-naive news. Because one of the things that's happening in the world, and there's been half a dozen books on this or more written in the last 5 years by credible people, is that the distribution of the idea of individual sovereignty and property rights and free market economies, etc., out into the rest of the world is making the non-Western world, is making the non-Western world rich really, really, really fast. So between 2000 and 2012, the rate of absolute poverty in the world fell by half. Half. It was the fastest period of economic development in human history. We beat the UN, we beat the optimistic UN target by 3 years. Staggering. You know, the rates of child mortality in Africa are now lower than they were in Europe in 1950. The fastest growing economies in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. Millions of people a month are getting access to this incredible technology that's embodied in cell phones, right? People have access to fresh water like they've never had access before. The kids are getting immunized at a rate that's unprecedented, and yet we have this idea that's become rampant in the West that there's something ultimately corrupt about the patriarchal tyranny and that it has to be dismantled right down to its core. And a lot of that's being taught by the activist disciplines in universities, and I just don't get it. It's